Worship with you always. Last Sunday we read through Luke 15 and the parable of the prodigal son, as we often call it. Prodigal means wasteful. I've not really understood that growing up, but I think, along with some others, maybe it shouldn't be called the prodigal son, but the forgiving father or the gracious God. But these three parables in a row paint a picture of God who seeks, who searches, who waits patiently for the lost, and once they are found, has a celebration. And that's how this last story, this third story, would end if it weren't for the rest of the story. Jesus could have stopped at what we call verse 24. That's where we quit reading last week, if you remember. But Jesus had more to say. Now remember, he's telling these stories because the Pharisees and teachers of the law were muttering. They were having issue with. They were not liking that he was spending so much time with sinners. In Jesus' story that we just read last week, there are two sons. The younger one has taken his part of the inheritance, left home, went to a far country, and there he squandered it all. And he comes back home, comes to his senses, comes back home, tells his father the sins he has done, expects to be treated like a servant. But the father wouldn't have it. He puts the robe on, the ring on, the sandals on, says, kill the fatted calf. The party is about to start. They're celebrating his return. And the encouragement from last week is, come home. For all of us, come home. In the words of Twyla Paris' song that's not new anymore, not forgotten, she sings, if your tired flesh has squandered what your spirit would have saved, and your aimless feet have wandered far from all you truly crave, turn and run towards your Father. Do not wait another day. See, his arms are open and he's calling out your name. Well, that was last week. That was the first son, the younger son. But Jesus is about to point to a stinker of a second son in the story. It's time to focus on him. So let's pick it up. If you want to turn there, Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 25. Meanwhile, he says, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come home, he said, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. Now, if you know the story, don't get ahead of the story. Right now, you can have something good to say about the older brother. And maybe you should. He stayed home while the other son was gone. He was out working while the other son is now partying. He seems responsible and decent and good. Probably he was. But on this day, when he nears the house, hears the music, is curious as, what's going on? A servant says, your brother is back. You haven't heard? He's home. He's okay. Your father has killed the fattened calf. It's time to party. Now, if this servant thought for a second that his brother might hear that news and choke back a tear and smile really big and maybe even give him a bear hug before he runs into the house to join the celebration, he would be wrong. Here's what happened. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, and I'll get to the rest later. I'm just guessing here, he probably thought his brother would never have come back home. Maybe he was good with that. Maybe he said to himself, I hope I never see his mug here again. Somehow his father knows the other brother is outside, so he comes out looking for him and talking to him. And we'll get back to that later. You don't have to wonder what this hardworking, responsible older son is feeling right now, because Jesus has already told us he's mad. He's angry. And before we keep reading, let's just simmer on that, because he's simmering. He's angry. He wasn't glad his brother was home. He was hot. He couldn't celebrate, not while he's stewing. He doesn't like this one bit. He couldn't celebrate, not now, maybe not ever. And he has a point, and he has an issue, and he's justified in his thoughts. That's why he refused to go in. This isn't right. And while the father is throwing a party for his son inside, notice his son outside is throwing a one-man pity party for himself. And he's shouting without really saying it, that's not fair. And he's holding a protest, even if he has no picket signs to wave. And we're turning our attention now from the one son now to the older, and look at the one son and now look at the other. But, as I keep telling you, watch the father. The father's the point of the story. Just like the father went out to meet his young son who selfishly spent everything he had, now that same father goes out to the other son who selfishly refused to celebrate. He tried to reason with him. He pleaded with him. The son wouldn't hear it. He had some things to say to dear old dad, and he said it, and I assume with passion. We don't know how long the father pleaded. I don't know if he said the words, calm down, or cool off, or have some compassion. But his son doesn't want to hear it. It's time for him to talk, and he will. And he does, right here. Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. Without hearing it, I imagine what the tone is. Do you? He starts with, look, look. He doesn't agree with his father. I imagine he's lost some respect for his father. He thinks dad is wrong, and he knows why, and he's telling him why, and he sees it very clearly. He knows what his brother did. He gets it. He understands the situation, sitting on his high and elevated vantage point, looking at his now ignorant father, saying, you look here, mister. You look here. Do you wonder if he's exaggerating as he tells this? In his anger, is he just blowing up, can't see straight, stretching the truth? All these years I've slaved for you, he says. Shows what he thought about working for his father, what that was like. Overstating it a little, isn't he? I've never, underline, never disobeyed your orders. Really? With this attitude, it's hard to believe you never disagreed or disobeyed. You never even gave me even a young goat to celebrate with my friends. Really? Really? And then he comes to this, what he really thinks about his brother. And when this son of yours doesn't even own him, no, not my brother, your son who squandered your property with prostitutes. Prostitutes? Is that true, or is he guessing? Is he exaggerating? Is he accusing without knowing? He crawls back home and you kill the fatted calf for him. Interesting, Dad, interesting. If the older son in this culture was supposed to represent the best of the father, then where is his mercy? Not one drop of grace. No room for that here. There's no time for that now. I think he probably wishes his brother hadn't come back. And if he came back like he did, he wishes his father wouldn't let him come in. Don't you wonder if the news came to him from that servant, your brother sadly has died in the far-off country, if then he wouldn't have smiled? If the music in the background wasn't partying but funeral music, would he then be happy? Watching him is like passing by a wreck on the side of the road. You don't want to look, but you can't help but stare. You stare at this brother saying, what's wrong with this guy? But while you're staring at him, would you please keep an eye on the Lord, on God, on the Father? And if you saw earlier in the story how the father showed restraint and love and compassion for the younger son, watch now as he shows it to the older son too. Keep going. My son, the father said, my son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours, but we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours, lays it back on him, this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Just like we couldn't hear the tone of the voice of the older brother, I don't know what it sounded like. I don't know the voice of the father either. But I'm guessing it sounded a lot like love. Because the father is stretching his arms out, trying to hold on to the older son while also holding on to the younger son. And he wants to hang on to both of them and says, I got a party. We have to do this. This is necessary. It's what wise fathers do even when the children don't understand. Did the younger son really appreciate who the father was, what he feels, how much he loves? Probably not. And does this older son get any of that either? I'm sure not. But none of that changes the heart of the father. He still loves both boys. And he is celebrating because one was lost and is here now, alive and home. Now, if the religious leaders were paying attention, and I'm not sure they were, this was said for them, for their sake, against them really, then right about now they should be deeply offended by the story. And if we who have grown up in church have heard this story hundreds of times maybe we've lost the offense too. But there's a part of this that is offensive, and it's in the way the Father acts. It's almost like he has too much compassion, too much grace, too much mercy, too much love. Frankly, we don't like it because we have standards. We disagree also sometimes with how he acts towards certain people. He so easily forgives the worst kind of sins and the worst kinds of sinners, and it happens, they're usually out there. That picture of God is almost too much to handle. And the Pharisees can't take it, and the scribes don't get it, and the teachers of the law don't like it, and some of them may be missing it completely. And I wonder how we do in here with that picture of God. A God who loves that much, who shows that much compassion, who is that gracious and forgiving. Thank God, God is like that. The way that young son left was appalling. What he did while he was gone, if we understand it, maybe it's embarrassing. We don't even know all the sins he participated in out there, but he did it and probably loved it, like we sometimes do too. But the only thing that matters to the Father right now is he came back home repenting. And the Father accepts him back. We don't know his motivation. We don't know the Father's reputation. We don't know what he's really doing right now. The only thing we know is he's back and his son is home. And he's partying. And he welcomes him and all who come home repenting. And he celebrates and throws a party, and everybody, it looks like, everybody in the story is partying but one. And he's probably got his arms folded, standing outside, huffing and puffing in anger. The Father was so forgiving and so kind and so gracious that the older son couldn't take it. He couldn't stand it. It made him sick. And if we are honest, I think maybe, just maybe, we might start seeing a picture of ourselves at times like that. Does any of this sound familiar? For the older son, there was no joy in his service for his father. Work had become a burden. Living in that home, working on that farm was a chore. Life was hard, and he could tell you how hard. He told his dad. He might have longed to have fun too. He wanted to party. Sure he did, but he couldn't. Why? He was responsible. He was busy. He was doing what he needed to do, holding down the fort, doing all the work, carrying the load. Have you ever felt like that in ministry? In church work, in service of the kingdom, ministers can feel that way. Have you? It appears he despises his brother and may have really written him off, as if he's dead. That's why he says, this son of yours, I don't own him. I don't know him. I'm not related to him. He's dead to me. I don't know. When he walked out the door, what am I supposed to do? Act like he's okay when he comes back? He crawls back. And what are we supposed to act like, Dad? Like, it's okay? I won't allow that. I won't forgive him. You shouldn't either. How can you act like this, Father? What's he supposed to do? Act like none of that happened? Act like a fool to welcome the fool back after what he's done? No, sir. Not me. Not now. Not with this. Not with him. I will not forget, and I will not forgive. And not only is that the best thing to do, it's the only way to do it. On a website, Chrissy Hardy references her failed marriages and her exes, and she boldly states, I don't forgive and I don't forget. I remember and I do better. And then gives some reasons why she has to remember and cannot forgive, and here's a couple of them. Some of them, those who've done her wrong, some don't really deserve forgiveness. Another, some people don't deserve a second chance. And a third, if they were worthy of me, they wouldn't have screwed me over. Sounds like the older son syndrome, doesn't it? The father, interestingly enough, was the one who was really wronged here, and he forgives. The son acts like, I'm the victim here, and he won't forgive. And since he's the center of his universe, he can't imagine why his brother's offense, so great, can just be forgiven like that. There's another blogger named Mandy back in 2014. She said, some persons don't deserve forgiveness. Some people should burn in hell. I hear this brother spirit living in our day today, and sometimes, sadly, it comes into church too. He can't forgive. How could he? And his father, he thinks, shouldn't forgive. How could he? I think he resents his brother, but I think he resents his father too. He disagrees with him, even wants to debate him. He despises his actions and tells him why he shouldn't do this. Questions fairness. And interestingly enough, all of us think fairness is about what helps me. But if the roles were reversed and this older brother actually was the one who left and came back on his knees asking for forgiveness, don't you think he would want grace? Oh, but that didn't happen. In his mind, that would never happen. He's better than that. He would never lower himself to that. That's beneath him. That's shameful. That's sinful. That's impossible. That's his view of himself. Why would he need mercy? Sadly, I have sometimes been something like that son. The picture I want us to keep focusing on, though, is not so much the son as the father. Notice how the father loved both sons. He was patient with both boys. He wanted both to understand what he was like and why he acted like he did. And that's right where Jesus ends the story, though. Did you notice that? Period. End of story. Like what? I mean, tell us more. Don't leave it there. What happened next? Jesus doesn't say what happens next. After the father's pleadings, did the older son's heart break? Did he say, I have done wrong, Father, forgive me, I'm going in to party with you? I love my son, my other brother, and I'm glad he's home? Or did he remain bitter and angry and resentful and unforgiving and judgmental and arrogant? I don't know, and Jesus doesn't say, he just leaves it. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? But do you know how kind and compassionate and loving and forgiving and merciful God our Father is? Because if you do, it can rock your world. That he could possibly forgive the worst of sins. Not possibly. He does. Now, some things to think about before we're done here. First, what a reversal. The story starts out with two sons at home. One gets the itch to leave, and he leaves, and the other son is dutifully still at home. Then the other son comes back after his sinful pleasures and his money is gone. He comes back home. By the end of the story, the son who was gone is now in the house of mercy with his father, and the son who never left can't bring himself to go into the house because there's too much mercy there, and refuses to be anything like his father. Now take a careful look this morning and be honest. You ever been in the shoes or the sandals of the older brother? And then answer this. How can one be so close to home yet so far from the Father? How can someone be so close to home but so far from the Father? It happens, you know. And it can happen to a Christian sitting in church on a Sunday morning. Second, Jesus must want the Pharisees and teachers of the law and all of the religious leaders to know the Father too. He longs for all sinners to come home, even the religious ones who are wrong. And he also wants them to know the Father loves them. They had the privilege, they had the blessing, they had the covenant, they had the mark of a sonship on their bodies through circumcision, but they were arrogant, they were judgmental, they were lacking in love and compassion. But despite all of their sins, the Father has not stopped loving them and wishing they could also be home and not refusing to come in but staying outside huffing and puffing. Third, it's sad, isn't it? The older brother who could list all of his brother's sins, but could not see any of his own. In his self-righteousness, he chose to pout, staying outside, stewing in bitterness, therefore missing out on the party and the joy and the grace of his father that he wanted to lavish on both boys. On any given Sunday in a church like this, there are Christians that can't hardly see their own sins but can list everyone else's. They like to keep score and make sure things are always fair. And fair, as it turns out to be good for them. Forgiveness is given only when it's necessary. Grace is conditional. Not too much celebration, not too much joy, not too much love. Cautious with mercy. They know God can save. He has saved them because they've been pretty good. It's obvious they've been pretty good. They have trouble believing God could really save the bad people, those out there. Those kind of people can be found in church, but you won't find them smiling, not celebrating with the saints. They don't like the joy. They'll keep busy tabulating the rights and wrongs, and in their scorebook, turns out they're right and everybody else is wrong. For these folks, forgiveness is hard to come by. They can't see it. They haven't really experienced it. They don't tend to share it. They have issues. Shakespeare knew the popular saying, "The fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool." The late Jimmy Hoffa supposedly said, "I may have my faults, but being wrong ain't one of them." Does this hit close to home for some of us? Because it does for me. Do we take offense at this story? Even a little bit? As Craddock points out, grace is offensive. We've been talking about it for several weeks now. Grace is offensive. In his words, of course, let the younger son return home. Judaism and Christianity have clear provisions for the restoration of the penitent returnee, but where does it say that such provisions include a banquet with music and dancing? Yes, he says, let the prodigal return, but to bread and water, not fattened calf, in sackcloth, not a new robe, wearing ashes, not a new ring, in tears, not in merriment, kneeling, not dancing. Has the party canceled the seriousness of sin and repentance? He writes that with a little tongue in cheek, but aren't there times when we have, at times, seen people come back home repenting with all of their heart, but we're not sure we're ready to give the forgiveness? Not yet. We would like to see a little bit of groveling, some tears, maybe a probation period. I mean, there are certain sins we would accept, but not those. Not those. I don't know if God can forgive those. Some things in our past we'd like to let go of, but some things I think I'll need to remind you of from time to time. Hey, I have some changing to do. I have found myself in this older brother's shoes too often to remember. I've been the younger son, no doubt, but I've been the older one too. And today, as we wrap up, maybe you have a mixture in you. Maybe all of us can come back home today, too. Ken Geyer prays this prayer in one of his books, and maybe it can be our prayer as we end. So later on, when we start singing, if you want to come forward and say, I'd like to say something here, and you want us to pray for you, that's great. But maybe when we sing the song, you can just stand there and repeat the prayer that he is going to pray. So maybe all of us, in some ways, could come forward standing in the same place we are. Here's the prayer, and then we'll sing. Thank you, Father, that although I have sometimes left home, I have never left your heart. Though I have forgotten about you, you have never forgotten about me. Thank you for the forgiveness and the restoration you have lavished upon me, the one who needed them most but deserved them least. I confess that there is inside me not only a prodigal son, but also a critical older brother. How dutiful I have sometimes been, and yet so proud of the duties I have done. How generous I have been in my opinion of myself, and so judgmental in my opinion of others. How often I have entered into criticism, and yet how seldom I have entered into your joy. So gather both the prodigal part of myself and the critical part of myself into your loving arms, O Lord, and bring them home. Let's stand and sing.
I need